Nestled away between Chichester and Selsey lies a forgotten piece of British railway history.
The casual observer would never know the line ever existed.
The Selsey Tramway, once a transportation lifeline for the remote Manhood Peninsula, now exists only through the stories of a bygone era and the few traces left behind. This unsuspecting stretch of the West Sussex countryside witnessed the passage of countless lives and stories.
The Selsey Tramway came about because local businessmen wanted to open up the Manhood Peninsula, which was a fairly remote sort of area. It was off the beaten track, so much so that Selsey used to be an island served by a ferry. But more recently, a causeway was built, and it was on that causeway that the tramway was built.
It was funded entirely locally. All of the land for it was acquired by agreement. But they needed an engineer, and they employed a guy called Colonel Holman F. Stevens, who was to become a very famous light railway engineer.
He built about 12 or 13 railways in the south of England, quite a reputation. And one of the ultimate aims of the railway was to create Selsey upon Sea and develop Selsey as a seaside resort to compete with Bracklesham and West Wittering and other neighbouring beaches. And at that time it was considered that railways would be the best way of doing that.
It was constructed incredibly cheaply. The line was very, very light indeed, and it didn't comply in any way with the current railways legislation. The rails were flat-bottomed light rails nailed directly to rough wooden sleepers. There were no signals on the line, the road crossings were ungated, the stations were most of them were unmanned. The tickets were sold on the train. But due to a quirk in that legislation, because they'd acquired all the land that they needed for the line, it didn't need to comply with that legislation. The government had no control over it, provided they didn't call it a railway. Hence it became the Selsey Tramway.
But it actually took 10 years to come into fruition, so the first plans would run up in 1887, but it wasn't until 1897 that the first train ran on the 27th of August out of Chichester station.
Crowds gathered at the Chichester terminus, brimming with anticipation for the monumental first excursion. However, this excitement took a blow when the first train arrived an hour late. In hindsight, you may say this set the standard for the rest of its run. However, this wasn't the only issue with the inaugural train.
When it was due to open, they bought themselves a brand new steam locomotive, which they named Selsey. Unfortunately, that wasn't actually ready in time to pull the opening train. So they had to bring in another locomotive, an elderly second-hand locomotive called Chichester, and that hauled the inaugural train. That locomotive was sort of typical of the motive power on the line. They had a rake of brand new carriages for the opening train, and they did acquire one more new carriage, but all of the rest of the stock, carriages, wagons, trucks, was all second-hand and rather well used.
I think it was quite well received because it was a good way of travelling. There would have been no cars, there were no buses. So initially, people would have commuted using the train, or they'd have gone down to Selsey to go to the seaside, or they'd have gone from Hunston or Siddlesham into Chichester. Otherwise, it would have been a 5 or 6 mile walk, wouldn't it? Or bicycle. It was later that its quirky nature probably got the better of people. The journey would take about 30 minutes. It was a mixed experience. On the one hand, you're thinking you're getting a railway journey, but at the same time, you're getting covered in soot. I mean, there are stories of houses that backed onto the railway line and people didn't put out their washing because they would get covered in soot.
On the shoulder platform, had an ice cream bloke there. He used to leave his float, and of course us kids used to get ice creams. But he always knew next day, he says, "You've always been at my ice cream again."
It was a sort of a joke, but I mean, say it served its purpose.
But it wasn't all just stolen ice creams and ruined washing. In this letter from 1933, W. Bishop gives his first-hand account of a journey on the tramway with his wife from Chichester down to Selsey.
We inquired of the conductor cum guard as to when the train would be leaving. He did not know, as the regular loco was out of service and the one they had was short of steam owing to leaking tubes in the firebox. There were no other passengers, and later the guard said they were ready to leave. Upon asking for 2 return tickets to Selsey, he said he would collect our fares on arrival, as we would probably want to return by bus. After leaving the station and crossing the road, we continued over the canal bridge where the train came to an abrupt halt. Being in open country, I looked out of the carriage window. I saw the loco travelling up the line on its own. The guard being on the track, I inquired what was wrong. He said, owing to the leaking firebox, the tanks were empty and the loco was going to the next station for water. Fortunately, this was Huntston, the only station between Chichester and Selsey where it was possible to get water. When the loco returned, we once again proceeded on our way. Before we could run into Huntston station, the driver had to stop at the level crossing for the fireman to proceed to the middle of the road to stop all road traffic. This occurred at 3 or 4 crossings on the way and was not good for timekeeping. After leaving Huntston, we were again brought to a halt in open country. This time it was for the guard and fireman to round up a horse which had strayed onto the track. There were no other incidents and we arrived at Selsey after taking well over 1 hour for the journey. We were still the only passengers on the train, and when we asked the guard for return tickets, he could hardly believe it.
The sights and sounds of the tramway, I think, are an integral part of it. It had lots of nicknames, and those nicknames gave rise to how you would describe the journey, namely slow and noisy. Clickety-click, bumpety-bump, the hedgerow railway because it ran along the edges of the fields, blackberry line because it used to stop so often people used to get off and pick blackberries.
If you went for the steam tram, you could always get out and pick flowers on the way, you know, or pick berries on the way.
In fact, they were all very quirky names. Probably the most quirky of all was the Siddlesham snail because it was perceived to be very, very slow. A song was written by a group of folk singers called the Siddlesham Snail, but the railway company were not happy with this song and they threatened staff with the sack if they were caught singing or whistling it.
Siddlesham Snail, the Siddlesham Snail, the boiler's burst again, she's off the rail. She's off the rail. The Siddlesham Snail, the Siddlesham Snail, the boiler's burst again, she's off the rail.
Well, there are actually 11 stations on the line eventually. It started from the Chichester terminus, which was built next to, but not part of, Chichester Main Line station. It then ran down to Huntston, the next village down, where there were watering facilities, and that was one of the manned stations. Chichester was not. From then on, it ran down through the peninsula. The next stop was in fact a private halt at Hoe Farm, which is now Chichester Golf Club. The following stop was Chalder, which was again next to a farm, but it served the north part of Siddlesham village. The next station originally was Siddlesham Station, which served the south part of the village. But in 1910, another halt was built between those 2 stations called Millpond Halt because of the floods that occurred during that year. The next station after Siddlesham, which was Ferry Station on the notorious bend on the Selsey Road. After Ferry, it ran through open countryside until it reached the original terminus, in fact, at Selsey Bridge Halt. That was because Selsey Town Station wasn't ready when they opened it. This is again typical of the way the rhyme was run. The actual terminus was Selsey Town, which was the main station on the line, had the locomotive shed, the goods shed, the offices and so forth. A bit later, an extension was built from there down to Selsey Beach to a station in what's now East Beach Car Park, but it wasn't very successful and it closed in 1905. But just after that, in 1908, a golf club opened in Selsey. Very quickly, a private halt was built for Selsey Golf Club between Ferry and Selsey Bridge, but that didn't feature in any timetable because it was a private station.
I couldn't imagine booking a tea time and then relying on the tram to get you there in time. The tramway ran along an embankment at the side of Pagham Harbour, and Pagham Harbour opened to the sea, and in 1910 there was a big surge storm and the land surrounding the harbour got flooded, including Siddlesham Station, which got wiped out.
In December 1910, a powerful storm swept across the Atlantic. Strong southwesterly gales, along with a significant tidal surge through the English Channel, impacted coastal regions, including the Manhood Peninsula. This surge, combined with several days of heavy rain, caused the sea to breach the peninsula's sea defences at Pagham Harbour. It has been estimated that 4,000 to 5,000 acres of land were flooded in less than 1 hour, including the tramway north of Ferry Station. It is said that parts of the line were under 12 feet of water.
Sidlesham Station was rebuilt, but it reappeared 90 degrees direction. It wasn't along the line, it was along the side of the line. Another station was built at Mill Pond Halt.
And it was not possible to run trains between Mill Pond Halt and the next station after Sidlesham, which was Ferry Station.
And there was a temporary measure, and that temporary measure was a coach and horses to take people between Sidlesham and Ferry.
In 1913, the tramway decided that it would like to extend itself. A branch line was proposed that ran from just south of the canal at Hunston and ran out to Birdham and down to the Witterings. It also included a branch into Itchenor, down to the shore of the harbour, where they planned to build a pier, a very bold project. And although all of the plans were drawn up and the application, it terminated with the start of the First World War and was never followed through. Following the First World War, passenger numbers picked up again afterwards. However, in 1923, a number of things happened. One very unfortunate incident was that the line suffered its first and only fatal accident. And this occurred when the 8:15 train from Selsey to Chichester had passed Golf Club Halt, in fact. A little bit further up the line, it ran off the rails. This wasn't untypical of trains on the Selsey Tramway, but this accident was rather more serious because it ran down the embankment, pulling the carriages off with it. The first carriage smashed into the back of the locomotive, and Mr. Barnes, the fireman, was killed instantly. An inquiry was held into the accident, which was held at the Selsey Hotel, in fact, which was the railway station hotel. The conclusion was that it was accidental death, but at the same time the jury said that they felt Colonel Stevens bore some responsibility due to the obvious poor maintenance of the line. Also in 1923, Colonel Stevens decided to turn to technology, and he introduced petrol rail cars to the line, which were cheaper to run, which were based upon road vehicles. The Ford Model T was the basis for one of them, and he hoped would be more reliable than the ancient stock that he had on there at the time. They were quite a success so far as the company was concerned, and he went on to introduce them on his other railways. But for passengers, they were bumpy, noisy, smelly, and a pretty uncomfortable ride, so we're told.
I was surprised to see a bus coming towards the station on rails. As with the train, there were no passengers, only the driver and conductor/guard. We took our seats with them in the leading bus, which was towing a wagon and trailing bus. It was not long before we regretted this decision, as the fumes and noise from the engine were terrific. I think it must have been running on paraffin oil. Owing to the uneven track and bad joints, one had to hold on to the seats and conversation was impossible. It would have been much more comfortable and quicker to have returned by Southdown bus.
The third thing that happened in 1923 was the line changed its name. It actually incorporated itself under an obscure piece of legislation called the Railway Construction Facilities Act, which meant it didn't become a light railway as such, but it did become a railway. And it changed its name to the rather grand West Sussex Railway. However, the change of status and name really didn't help the railway. Although it carried on for quite a few more years, and in fact the petrol rail cars were in use for over 10 years on the line, it probably suffered from the improvements that were being made in roads and road transport, and it couldn't manage the competition. The number of passengers diminished, the number of trains per day fell, and eventually, at the beginning of 1935, immediate closure was announced. The railway was put up for sale as a whole, and it was bought by Mr. Watkins from Gloucestershire for £3,610. He then put all of the surplus material up for sale, and it was sold off by auction in 1936 at Selsey Station. And that, by all accounts, was really the end of the railway. It's all but forgotten today, mainly because, after it was dismantled, virtually nothing was left. The lifting bridge over the canal was removed by the local council during the war. The bridge over the Rife ferry was destroyed. The bridge under the road at Selsey was filled in, so very little now remains.
If you were to wander around this area, you would go down the canal and you would see big concrete buttresses, maybe wonder what they were, and they were the buttresses of the lifting bridge. If you come into Siddlesham, you will see where it crossed the Rife. If you're in Stockbridge, you see where it crosses the road.
The casual observer would never know the line ever existed. We discovered, though, that the station platform at Chichester still exists for its full length, together with the base of the waiting room.
All of these artefacts need to be preserved, but these are just remnants of a bygone era. It's the stories like the Siddlesham snail and, unfortunately, the death of the fireman when the train crashed that give the Siddlesham snail its individuality and what brings it to life.
The memory of the Selsey Tramway really should be preserved, because it was one of the quirkiest, most eccentric lines ever built in this country, and it absolutely deserves its place in both British and railway history.
You know, local heritage is just as important.
It connects people to the land and the landscape in which they live. To have an understanding of the history of your environment, in my view, is very important and has always interested me. And we're finding that it interests a lot of other people as well.
Walk the Selsey Tramway is one of a series of heritage trails that Manor Wildlife and Heritage Group have created,
which we felt would help to preserve the memory of the Selsey Tramway.
However, this one has gone much further, in so much as we have created an interactive map which is on the web, so people can follow it on their mobile phone. We've got waymarkers on West Sussex County Council footpath posts, and we've got information boards at the sites of all 11 stations and one or two other interesting places as well.
The walk follows public footpaths, and it follows the course of the line as far as it can. Most of the line has reverted to private ownership, so it does vary from the actual route. Consequently, the walk is 11 or 12 miles long rather than the original 7.5 miles of the route.
But it is served by the 51 bus, and it is possible to do it in stages.
Nevertheless, the walk does provide a good feeling of the kind of countryside that the tramway passed over, and it does visit the site of almost all the stations along the way.
And we organise walks ourselves.
It was a great pleasure to be able to join with Bill on this project, because it extends so far beyond just creating a walking trail.
I'm very proud to be part of it because it reaches a much wider audience, which is ultimately what we're on about, getting more people to absorb the heritage. So hopefully more people will come on those walks.
We'd rather cheer than grumble at a much maligned snail, and the faithful crew's sense of humour didn't fail, remembering a journey's full of laughter, joy and fun. Now legal trends of wistful tears and travelling days are done. The Selsey snail, the Selsey snail. The boiler's burst again, she's off the rail. The Selsey snail, the Selsey snail. The the boilers